one thing that I pride myself on. Sometimes I'm great at it, sometimes I'm not, but my batting average is pretty high with it, and that's creating an environment of psychological safety. Psychological safety is where you can share anything on your mind and heart, and you're not going to be met with guilt, shame, blame, or pain. So I'll give you an example. Um, the very first time my mom caught me with a porn tape, a VHS porn tape, it was met with, "You're disgusting. You're going to hell." That's a more like all these horrible things, right? That I was, you should be ashamed of yourself. What's wrong with you? I mean, I thought I was like an abnormal pervert, which, you talk to your friends and they're all doing the same stuff, right? So, that basically taught me, okay, I shouldn't go and talk to my mom about this stuff because I'm going to be met with this. So my style of parenting is I'm I'm the place, I am the person where you can bring all your dirty laundry, and it's going to be met with whatever you tell me, I'm not going to be surprised, right? Or at least I'm not going to act surprised. And to date, I have been shocked with some of the things that have been told me, but not because I think they're abnormal, but because my kids have felt so comfortable telling me some of these things. Like I had a conversation, I'm going to keep it private, with one of my boys where we were sitting there playing a game one night, and he just openly told me something that he was tempted to do. And I'm not going to share what it is. It's nothing illegal, but it's something I would have never have said to my parents ever. And it was something he was tempted to do that evening. And I was like, "What?" And I met that way. I didn't meet it with like, "What's wrong with you, man? You shouldn't be doing that." Instead, I was like, "Wow." I was like, "Man, that probably took a lot of courage for you to tell me that." And he's like, "Yeah, it did." I was like, "God love you, man." I was like, "How do you feel now?" Like just saying that out loud. He's like, "I feel better." I was like, "Cool." I was like, "You want to talk through it?" And he's like, "Yeah." And we did. And it was met with, he walked away from that conversation with a couple different things. Number one, the temptation was no longer there, and what he wanted to do, he didn't do. Number two, he knew that the next time he was faced with something like that, he now knows he has a template and a blueprint and an experience that he can come back to me, and he knows that I'm going to be consistent with that. So back to your question though, I'm a big believer in, I don't like to lecture. And I don't like to lecture because I think our kids just tune us out. And we think we have like these grandiose like pieces of advice and ways to live their life and all this other stuff. When in actuality, it's more powerful if they say it and I don't. So instead of lecturing, I just ask a lot of questions. And I'm happy to give you an example of that if you want.
Absolutely. Yeah, let's run through this. And I'd like to, even maybe zero in a little bit more on what the men out there can do to have the tools to create these environments of psychological safety.
Yeah. So if you're going to create this environment of psychological safety where your kids and your wife will come and talk to you about things, then you need to be vigilant. I always tell guys, be vigilant that anything can be shared with you at any time and you just don't be surprised by it. Like be ready for it. Kind of like a Navy SEAL, right? They're always battle ready. Always. Even in civilian life, they're always eyeballing a situation, right? They're being vigilant. Same thing. If you're vigilant, then there's not a whole lot of things that will shock you because you're ready for it. So be ready for it. So I'll give you an example. I didn't make the best grades growing up and for a long time, and until I actually found fitness, and then my grades turned around. Kind of a crazy result, right? But I wasn't the best student, and I always remember whatever grades I got was met with a lot of consequences, a lot of yelling, a lot of shouting, and a lot of lecturing. Which all that made me, it didn't help a thing. So what I do with my kids is, let's just say one of them comes home with a not so great grade, on a test. They might tell me, they'd be like, "I got a D on that test," right? And I'll be like, "Man, thanks for telling me that. That probably took a lot of courage." So I always like to meet them with that, right? "Thanks for telling me that. That probably took a lot of courage." And I make sure that I use the right voice tone. I don't say, "Man, well, that took a lot of courage." Because now that the meaning of that and how it lands for them is going to be different. It's more condescending, right? More insulting. But if I have that inflect of curiosity, like, "Wow, that probably took a lot of courage." Now it lands for them like, "Yeah, it did." So I'm like, "Well, great." I was like, "Well, so tell me about it. Tell me why you think you got the D." And they'll be like, "Well, and they'll tell me why. I wasn't really ready for the material, or I was ready for half of it. Some of the questions took me by surprise." They'll go through like some of the things, right? I don't need to tell them that. They can tell me. I'd be like, "Yeah." I was like, "Well, let me ask you this. I always love this question. It's a great generative question. Anytime you have a bad moment as a kid, one of the greatest questions we can ask as parents is, if you had to do this situation over again, what would you do different? Basically what you're doing is they are debriefing their own situation. Like they're the ones who are debriefing it, not you. And they're like, I probably would have studied 2 more nights. I sloughed off, 2 nights, and I tried to cram it all in one night. Or I only studied half the material. I thought I knew the other half and I didn't. Or I would get with a group, and study as a group with people, that kind of thing. I think that would have got me a better grade. I didn't have to tell them any of that. They did. And what comes from them, they're going to be more driven to do, and they're going to have more skin in the game to do it versus me just telling them and lecturing them. I'm like, man, that's good insight. Well, let me ask you this. When is your next test? And they'll be like, well, I got one next Wednesday. Like, okay, well, based on what you've told me and what we've learned through this situation, what would you do different getting prepared for that one versus this one? And they'll tell me. They will literally tell me the plan. I don't have to tell them anything. And then I'm like, that's a great plan. I think that's a great idea. How can I best support you? Would you like for me to check in with you? I can hold you accountable. If you want, I can even quiz you the night before. What feels right to you? And I like to use those word feeling, like what feels right to you, because kids are feeling people. And they'll kind of like think about it, and they'll be like, if you could just check in with me, that'd be awesome. Or if you could quiz me, that would be really, really helpful. You got it. It's a good plan. I think you're going to do well on this next test. So then he exits that conversation with like, man, Dad didn't yell at me. I wasn't met with guilt, shame, or not that they can articulate that. I wasn't met with like a barrage of guilt and blame and all this other stuff. And I learned something. And I learned something about me and how I operate and how I can optimize the next experience with my test. I didn't have to do a thing except for guide them with questions to get to their own solutions. And I think that's how you can create an environment of psychological safety. And guess what? Your kids will perform better because they have more skin in the game to stick to their plan versus the grandiose plan that I might have made for them.